She stood on the dock yelling as if the lake belonged to her. She shouted that I could not park my boat there, waving a clipboard like it carried the law. I looked at her, calm but irritated. I was simply lowering my new houseboat into the lake on my own ranch. Karen ignored every fact around her. She pointed at an HOA sign across the road and claimed the water was under their authority. She threatened to call the police if I did not move. I laughed and told her the lake sat inside my fence line. I pointed to the old wooden post that clearly read private property, Wilson Ranch. Her expression twitched, yet she doubled down. She claimed her HOA had jurisdiction over shared water access. She snapped that I was violating community rules even though I did not live in her community. My ranch had stood here since my granddad's time, long before the HOA existed. Before I could say anything else, she pulled out her phone and began dialing. She shouted that she was calling the police because I was trespassing. 5 minutes later, 2 patrol cars rolled up the dirt road. Karen marched toward them like she owned them, putting on a show. She pointed at me and accused me of invading HOA property with my boat. The officers looked puzzled. One turned to me and asked if I lived here. I nodded and handed him a folder from my truck. I explained that I owned everything within the fence line, including the lake, and suggested he check the county map before believing. Karen. The officer stepped aside with my papers and began verifying them on his tablet. Karen smirked like she had already won. She hissed that I was bluffing and claimed the entire area was HOA managed. When the officer returned, his tone changed. He told her the land and water were privately owned and that the HOA boundary ended half a mile away. Her smile cracked. She insisted their maps were correct and the officer's maps were wrong. I smiled for the first time and suggested she check who owned her marina down the road. Her head snapped up. She asked what I meant. I grinned as the color drained from her face. 7 minutes before she had called the police, I had finalized the purchase of the marina she assumed was hers. Her jaw dropped. She asked if I had bought their marina. The officers exchanged glances, trying not to laugh. I shrugged and told her it was not hers anymore. The county auction closed that morning. She blinked rapidly, trying to keep her composure. She claimed it was illegal. I stepped closer and calmly told her that it was perfectly legal and already done. The HOA had failed to pay back taxes for 3 years, so the marina was repossessed. I bought it for the price of her SUV. She fell silent. The officers returned her fake complaint notice and told her she was fortunate I was not pressing trespassing charges. Karen still refused to quit. She raised her phone and began recording me. She yelled that I was a fraud and lying to law enforcement. I pointed to the camera mounted on my boat's roof. I told her to keep recording because my footage had clear sound and the sheriff's office received a live feed. Her hand froze. She stammered, asking what I meant. Before I could reply, a black SUV pulled up with a familiar face stepping out. Sheriff Daniels, my late granddad's old friend, walked straight toward me. He asked if there was HOA trouble again. Karen's face went pale. She rushed toward him, claiming I was breaking HOA rules. Daniels raised a hand and told her to stop. He explained that the property lines were already checked and the lake, dock, and access road all belonged to Wilson Ranch. He told her she was the one trespassing. She tried to argue, but her voice cracked. She insisted it could not be true. I told her it was true and added that since I now owned the marina, her HOA's boats were technically docked on my property. The sheriff chuckled and said she would need a new map or a new lawyer. Karen stood frozen as HOA members gathered behind her, whispering among themselves. One of them quietly asked if I had really bought the marina. I smiled and said yes, and that docking fees would triple starting tomorrow. The crowd murmured like a disturbed hive. Some wondered if I could legally do that. An older man said that if I owned the marina, then yes. Karen spun toward them with panic rising in her voice. She told them not to listen to me and claimed it was manipulation. She insisted they would challenge it in court. Even her own members looked unsure. One woman folded her arms and reminded Karen that she had told them the HOA owned the lake. Karen grew red-faced and claimed the papers were somewhere. She flipped through her clipboard as if it could save her, but the sheriff had already contacted the county registrar. A moment later, he held up his phone and announced that county records confirmed the legal transfer of the marina to Wilson Ranch that morning. Silence fell. The only sound was the water touching the dock. I looked at Karen and told her she had spent years bossing people around and might finally learn what it felt like to be on the other side. She glared at me, trembling with anger. She shouted that I could not take over everything they had built. I smirked and reminded her that the HOA had pressured people for years and that I had every right to buy what they failed to maintain. One HOA member let out a nervous laugh and said they might need to start paying me now. Karen whipped around, warning them not to side with me. She shouted that she was still the HOA president. I calmly pulled out a folded document and told her she was not anymore. Without the Marina, the HOA lost half its chartered area, meaning her presidency had expired. Her clipboard slipped from her hands and hit the dock with a heavy thud. In desperation, she yelled that I would regret this and that I would never get away with it. She stormed toward her SUV, but before she could leave, two men in suits approached from another car. One flashed a badge and said the HOA funds had been under investigation for 6 months. They needed to ask her some questions. Karen froze. She asked what they were talking about. The sheriff folded his arms and said it was not her lucky day. The investigator stepped closer and showed her a file filled with bank statements. They informed her that HOA funds had been used for personal expenses. Her voice shook as she tried to deny it, but the sheriff cut her off and told her to save it for court. As they led her to the SUV, she glared at me with pure resentment. She shouted that I had ruined everything. I told her she had done that all on her own. When the vehicles left, the lake grew quiet. The HOA members turned toward me. One man asked what would happen next. I looked at my boat floating gently on the water and told him they could still use the Marina as long as they respected the rules. He nodded and agreed. I took a deep breath as the sunset reflected across the lake that had sparked all this trouble. My granddad used to say that land did not make anyone powerful, and that how a person treated others did. I smiled and whispered that the lake was finally in good hands again. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible HOA stories.